The bonus feature of this EQ is that it can be operated on a per-band basis as a dynamic EQ. Except for the filters, this option is accessed independently for each band via the Dynamic Mode power button. By default, the bands are all in static mode, like a normal EQ. If you enable Dynamic Mode, then that band will only kick in when the audio crosses a threshold, which you set just to the right. You can set it to compress or expand the gain setting you make by hand for that band. I'll explain how it works. To operate a band as a dynamic EQ, you enable it and choose Compress or Expand. Then you set a target amount of booster cut for the band. Now, as the audio plays, that band will remain either flat or as set until the audio approaches the threshold you set with the threshold control at the lower right. As the audio approaches the threshold level, the band will begin to apply gain, positive or negative gain, reaching the target setting you dialed up when the signal has fully exceeded the threshold. Here's an example to illustrate its usefulness. Let's say you had a bass part where a certain note boomed a bit too much. With a standard static EQ, you could dial in a cut at the appropriate frequency. But now the whole part might sound a bit too thin. Of course, you could set up a multi-band compressor to address it, but that means a whole nother processor just for that one issue. Instead, Dynamic EQ can handle it. You'd find the appropriate frequency, select Compress, and set the threshold so the EQ kicks in, cutting up to the amount of gain reduction you dialed up, only when the one offending note plays. Even if the part needed an overall boost in that range, you could still have the EQ dynamically cut when that note hits the threshold. Now it'll simply reduce the amount of boost that works for the rest of the track. Here's another example. A Rhodes piano has a few high notes that ring out too much. Dipping the treble with static EQ may dull down the overall sound too much, but a dynamic cut in that frequency range could be set to kick in only when the offending notes cross the threshold, preserving the tone of notes in lower registers. Finally, like the compressor, a band operating in dynamic EQ mode can be controlled via a sidechain signal. This can come not only from audio in the same band, but from audio that falls within another band, even from an external EQ elsewhere in the mix. You'd have to set up the routing with the DAW sidechain options, but it does allow for some serious flexibility. You could set a dynamic EQ booster cut to kick in only when other notes play, or even when another instrument plays in a certain frequency range. This would especially make sense in conjunction with the EQ's masking feature. In fact, when you get to that video, you'll see an example of dynamic EQ used as part of that function. Now you may have noticed that I skipped over that button, the one labeled Masking, as well as the Learn and Reset buttons above the display. That's because they relate to Neutron's intelligent features and automatic processing options, which I'll be covering separately in dedicated videos a little later in the course. So for now, I'll move on to the next processor, the Neutron compressor.